Okay, well, welcome to the second session, looking at experiences of children and families affected by domestic violence and parental alienation. I'm Edward Kruk, and I will be moderating the session. We have speakers from across the globe, actually, from Canada, myself, and from the UK, Germany, and Iran. And you may be surprised to know that there's actually a lot of scholarship going on in Iran across several universities on the topics of shared parenting and parental alienation. It's considered to be a women's rights issue over there. And so we have our Iranian speaker set to go as well. So I think I can begin without further ado to look at some new research on grandparent alienation. And I use the term the primal wound, which is a term that was used by one of the grandparents, and I'll explain what that means in a few moments. So grandparent alienation is an under-researched, rapidly growing global problem that's had a devastating impact on the lives of millions of children and grandparents worldwide. Grandparents are alienated from their grandchildren, both after parental separation or as a result of both parents withholding their children from grandparents' lives in non-separation situations. So the purpose of my presentation actually is twofold. First of all, to introduce you to the core issues respecting grandparents who are alienated from their grandchildren. And secondly, to consider some practical strategies for prevention and intervention in cases of grandparent alienation. At the outset, it's important to note that grandparenting today consists of enormous variations. Whereas most grandparents have a relationship with their grandchildren, many grandparents today have absolutely no contact with their grandkids. The role of grandparents in society has undergone a profound shift to the extent that some grandparents choose to be less active and involved in their grandchildren's lives, while for others, grandparenthood is the most important part of their identity. Some grandparents selectively invest in some of their grandchildren, but not others. There are also grandparents who have strong attachments with their grandchildren, but suddenly find that the relationship is terminated. And there are many grandparents who have never even laid eyes on their grandchildren and desperately yearn to see them. As older persons now live longer and remain healthy for a longer period of time, they're more likely to become grandparents and maintain that role for a prolonged period. Many will be grandparents for at least 20 or 30 years. The reciprocal significance of the grandparent-grandchild relationship is a popular subject for social scientists. In the research, grandparents are described as providing a source of unconditional love and companionship to their grandchildren, acting as emotional buffers and mediators between children and their parents, and being the purveyors of family traditions, providing children with a sense of roots and identity. Indirectly, grandparents are seen as contributing to child development also by providing respite care for parents. Grandparenting roles can take on added significance during periods of family crisis and transition. During divorce, for example, grandparents can provide reassurance, continuity, stability, and emotional support at a time when parents may not be as emotionally available to their grandchildren. And they also provide a sanctuary and a source of support otherwise not available to children. So for many children and their grandparents today, the grandparent-grandchild attachment bond is very important. Now, parents are gatekeepers of grandparent-grandchild relationships. The grandparent-grandchild relationship rests upon the voluntary consent of the parents. And the nature of the grandparent-grandchild relationship is largely shaped by the kinds of relationships that exist between grandparents and their adult children and their children-in-law. Grandparent alienation can occur in different circumstances. It can occur as a result of divorce, but also in situations of conflict with one's adult child or child-in-law in an intact marriage situation. It can follow the death of one adult child, step-parent adoption, or children living together with neither of their biological parents. In my research on grandparent alienation, which now spans about 25 years, actually, I've noted two circumstances that really stand out, and two groups of grandparents who seem to be at the highest risk. The first are grandparents. Grandparents are at high risk of losing contact with grandchildren after parental separation, when the child-in-law is the custodial parent. And second, grandparents are at high risk of never having contact with their grandchildren after being alienated from their own children in childhood. And I'll talk more about this in a few minutes. So what is grandparent alienation? I've put out a couple of definitions. One is the one I've used recently: the programming of a grandchild by the parent or parents to denigrate the grandparent in an effort to undermine and interfere with the child's relationship with that grandparent. It does not pertain to those cases where a child has been victimized by abuse and the child is fearful of the grandparent as a result. And now adapting the definition of parental alienation from the Parent Alienation Study Group, the two main features of grandparent alienation are the child's unjustified rejection of and refusal of contact with the grandparent, and the parent's abusive strategies to denigrate the grandparent. Now, again, adapting Amy Baker's work on parental alienation. In the assessment and diagnosis of grandparent alienation, 5 factors are usually present. First of all, the child refuses contact and expresses hatred or indifference toward the targeted or rejected grandparent. In some cases, but not all, in some cases, there was a prior positive relationship between the child and the now rejected grandparent. Thirdly, there's an absence of abuse or neglect by the targeted grandparent. There are multiple alienating behaviors by the alienating parents, and there are behavioral manifestations in the child, things like denigration of the targeted parent, weak or untrue rationalizations, lack of ambivalence, absence of guilt, and borrowed scenarios from the alienating parent. In my first research project on grandparent alienation, I interviewed 55 grandparents who had experienced alienation after enjoying a close and loving relationship with their grandchildren. I collected data on various aspects of the grandparent-grandchild relationship before and after the onset of alienation. I looked at reasons for alienation and the impact of lost grandchild contact on the grandparent. I asked the grandparents what caused their loss of contact with their grandchildren. 75% reported that alienation was the result of one parent withholding access after parental divorce. 25% was the result of both parents withholding access. I found that in divorce situations, the likelihood of reestablishing contact with grandchildren following an initial period of access difficulties is actually higher than in non-divorce situations. The prognosis for reestablishing contact is very poor if grandparent alienation was the result of both parents withholding access. In my first study, grandparent alienation was most common following parental separation. In 90% of these cases, the adult child was female, and paternal grandparents were most at risk of losing contact with their grandchildren when the mother was the custodial parent. 80% of the grandparents identified the discouragement of contact by their adult child-in-law as the main problem. I also asked grandparents how contact had been discouraged. Denied access was mentioned by 80% of the grandparents. 50% cited a variety of more subtle and indirect means, which made contact awkward or strained. 30% cited the relocation of the child-in-law and grandchildren, or lack of knowledge of the grandchildren's whereabouts. And 20% cited the constraints of highly controlled, restricted, or supervised visits. Most grandparents cited a number of ways that contact was discouraged rather than just one. But what seemed to prevail was the frequency of denied access. I concluded that it's the adult child-in-law rather than the grandparent's own adult child who is the primary obstructor in the ongoing grandparent-grandchild relationship. In 19 of the 20 divorce situations where grandparents were alienated, the child-in-law was the custodial mother. In contrast, in non-divorce situations where grandparent alienation occurred, their own adult child was more likely to be the mother and their child-in-law the father in 9 of 15 cases. In both divorce and non-divorce grandparent alienation situations, it seems that mothers were the primary gatekeepers and obstructors of the grandparent-grandchild relationship in most cases. The consequences of alienation for grandparents were quite profound. The great majority of grandparents described experiencing a grief reaction containing all the major elements of bereavement, related directly to the absence of their grandchildren and loss of the grandparent role. Now, it's been some time since I did that study, and there have been a few replications of that research with similar findings. But recently, actually, over the course of the last 2 months, I embarked on another study of grandparent alienation. Over the years, I've heard from increasing numbers of alienated grandparents who have never seen their grandchildren and seem to be in acute distress. So I embarked on what is the first research study of alienated grandparents who have never seen their grandchildren. I've just finished collecting data from 65 grandparents in this project. The results are very rich, surprising, and unexpected. I haven't yet completed the full data analysis, but I can share with you some of the main preliminary findings. So this is a rapidly growing population, number one, but it's a very isolated group of people. They're a hidden population, and their numbers are much higher than we imagine them to be. They're a very different population to grandparents who had a previous relationship with their grandchildren. Previously involved grandparents most often lose contact with their grandchildren after parental separation. But those who've never seen their grandchildren most often were alienated from their child by their former spouse, and now their adult child alienates them from their grandchildren. So parents who are alienated from their children are likely to become grandparents who are alienated from their grandchildren. As far as reasons for alienation are concerned, then, grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren were alienated from their grandchild by the alienating parent. Grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren were alienated from their child by the alienating parent, and this child now alienates them from their grandchildren. They never reconciled. There was never any reunification. The depth of the hatred and the intensity of hostile feelings by the now adult child toward the alienating parent is just as strong as it was years ago when the child was much younger. So that's the main reason, but it's not the only reason. Grandparents identified 2 other primary reasons for alienation. First, they talked about political, ideological, and religious divisions between their adult children and themselves. And by the way, this study took place with grandparents from the United States and Canada, primarily the US. So they identified political, ideological, and religious divisions between their adult children and themselves, and the perception of adult children that such value differences are sufficient reasons to sever all contact. And secondly, they talked about a culture that promotes the idea of cutting out so-called toxic parents and extended family members from one's life. There's a lack of support in Western societies for maintaining family ties. Family relationships are undermined, not supported within a culture that's highly divided along political and generational lines. Many grandparents cited the toxic effects of social media in this regard. So these grandparents suffer a double whammy. They simultaneously mourn the loss of their children and their grandchildren from their lives. In many ways, their grief is more pronounced. Despite never having seen their grandchildren, they use words such as trauma, that came up almost in every case. The term primal wound came up, tragedy of the greatest proportions, and they reported very severe mental and physical health problems. Whereas alienated parents seem to cling to the hope of reunification, grandparents who've never seen their grandchildren focused on the lost time and the lost opportunities that can never be restored. Now, again, interestingly, maternal grandparents appear to be at the greatest risk of never having contact with grandchildren after being alienated from their now adult daughters or being the victims of family violence when their daughters were children. Although the negative effects on grandparents are profound, grandparents are mostly concerned about the devastating effects of grandparent alienation on their grandchildren, who suffer the effects of grandparent absence and are unaware of their grandparents' love for them. Also, when it comes to seeking legal and therapeutic help, these grandparents are in a double bind. How do they establish contact without making things worse for their children and grandchildren by seeking out legal help or therapeutic help? They're much less likely to make the use of services of lawyers, therapists, and mediators. They're acutely aware of how much grandchildren need their grandparents. They're acutely aware of the lack of support services to parents and grandparents. So I'd now like to turn to the second half of my presentation, strategies for prevention and intervention in cases of grandparent alienation. And I'll start with prevention. Prevention begins with education. Learning about the core elements and dynamics associated with both parental alienation and grandparent alienation. This is a phenomenon that's affected millions of children and families worldwide. The best way to prevent grandparent alienation is to address the problem of parental alienation. Grandparent alienation is often a fallout of parental alienation. In parental separation situations where the custodial parent alienates the target parent and at the same time the grandparents-in-law, but also in non-divorce situations where a grandparent has been alienated from a child who then denies them contact with their grandchildren. Prevention of grandparent alienation requires a multifaceted approach, recognition of parental alienation as a form of family violence, warranting a criminal law response, recognition of parental alienation as a form of child abuse, warranting a child protection response, reform of family law in the direction of establishing a legal presumption of shared parenting, as shared parenting is a bulwark against parental and grandparent alienation, and finally, treatment, establishing a network of family support services to assist families in the separation and divorce transition, keeping the grandchildren's needs and well-being at the forefront. Finally, in regard to prevention, is the importance of grandparents taking the high road in regard to maintaining good relations with adult children and children-in-law as gatekeepers of the grandparent-grandchild relationship. By this, I mean being supportive of both parents in their parental roles, avoiding taking sides in disputes, and generally not getting caught up in conflict with either their own adult children or with their children-in-law. The reality is that parents are gatekeepers of grandparent-grandchild relations, and it pays to maintain good relations with both parents. Next, I'd like to talk about support services for grandparents. First, whereas professional service providers may be of benefit to alienated grandparents, mutual aid self-help groups are vital to grandparents who are feeling isolated and alone. Many are in a state of learned helplessness and recognize that legal and therapeutic agents often are unable to provide the help they need. Self-help groups can empower grandparents to not give up, to know they're not alone, and validate the vital role they play or can play in the lives of their grandchildren. Second are legal supports. Grandparents do have legal rights, but the extent of these vary from one state and country to another. Almost no grandparents in my study reported that legal practitioners help them in any way. At the same time, it's important to keep in mind that grandparent alienation is a form of family violence, and family violence is a serious issue. Third are therapeutic resources, including both reunification programs and therapeutic supports and services for grandparents and their grandchildren. As is the case with parental alienation, intervention in cases of grandparent alienation is a very sensitive matter. Reunification efforts should be undertaken with service providers with specialized expertise in parental alienation reunification. Finally, just a brief mention about an intervention that's underutilized, but holds promise as an alternative to legal intervention and also traditional therapeutic intervention in cases of grandparent alienation, and that is multi-generational family mediation aimed at grandparent-grandchild reunification in cases of alienation. But both parties have to be willing to engage in the mediation process. Also, when divorcing parents come to mediation with child custody and access disputes, it's important for mediators to assess the nature of grandparent-grandchild relationships. Where there are established positive bonds, it may be useful to involve family elders in the actual mediation negotiations. Mediators have an important role to play in the resolution of access disputes between grandparents and parents, regardless of the circumstances surrounding broken contact between grandparents and grandchildren. This represents an untapped area for mediation. So the case for ongoing grandparent involvement in the lives of grandchildren has been made very clear in the research literature. Child development experts agree about the importance for the child to maintain meaningful post-divorce relationships that are beneficial with family members. Secondly, grandparents may well be the most important source of support to children and also to parents during times of crisis, like divorce, a time when parents, overwhelmed by the stresses they're facing, are relatively insensitive to children's emotional needs. Grandparents can be the safety net in the family during divorce and other crises. And finally, to conclude, I'll just leave you with these 3 points. The true measure of a nation's standing is how well it attends to its most vulnerable members. And here I'm talking about both children and elders being the most vulnerable, being concerned about their health and safety, their material security, their social life, and their sense of being loved, valued, and included in the extended families and societies in which they live. Again, my mantra is it's the responsibility of social institutions to support grandparents, who in turn support parents in the fulfillment of their responsibilities to their children's needs, including their need for meaningful and caring relationships with their grandchildren, with their grandparents rather, and their extended family. And finally, prevention and intervention are vital to addressing the growing problem of grandparent-grandchild alienation, commensurate with the well-being and best interests of most children and families. Okay, thanks for your attention, and